So back in gorgeous London town, it's a hot, sweaty, sticky summer day. But the only thing hotter, sweatier, stickier than a hot summer day in London is a Fujifilm GFX 100. Look at this bad boy. 100 megapixel medium format sensor, 5-axis in-body image stabilization. I'm gonna run around Chinatown, Leicester Square, as far as I can get without Fuji calling the cops on me to bring this thing back. I'm gonna take some sample images and let you know if this lives up to the hype. I think it will.
Just like Billy from Stranger Things, the Fujifilm GFX 100 is the new biggest dog in the photography yard. With a whopping 102 megapixel medium format sensor and £10,000 price tag, it boasts the biggest bulges of any camera out there. Well, except for the Phase One IQ4, which packs 150 megapixels on a true, full-size medium format sensor along with a £50,000 price tag. However, where the IQ4's humongous size effectively limits it to studio and stationary tripod work, the GFX 100 is a much more mobile and nimble medium format camera. Weighing in at almost 500 grams less than the Phase 1, boasting 5-axis in-body image stabilization and a 3-way tilt screen, Fujifilm's 100 megapixel monster can be deployed in the studio, on location, and even used for street photography. Yes, using a medium format camera for street photography is a bit like taking a bazooka to a knife fight. But taking it out onto the streets of London was a great test, not only of the GFX 100's all-round practicality, but also of the efficacy of its image stabilization, something that has never been attempted before with an image sensor of this size. Some of the greatest strengths of the GFX 100 are those that aren't traditionally found in medium format cameras. For starters, it's about the same size and weight as a Pro DSLR, and in operation, it effectively works like a jumbo-sized version of a Fuji X series body. Being thrown onto the streets of London having never used the camera before, it demonstrated just how instinctive and straightforward the GFX is to use. While it ditches Fujifilm's traditional shutter speed and ISO dials, this actually makes it a bit more friendly to non-Fuji shooters who are accustomed to more standard controls. And the top OLED panel can display virtual dials if you really want them. The rear LCD is a good-sized 3.2-inch touchscreen with 2.36 million dots. But given the blinding sunshine, I honestly didn't spend that much time using it. Instead, I composed using the phenomenal 5.76 million dot OLED EVF, which is as close to using an optical viewfinder as I've ever experienced. Unlike other medium format cameras, the autofocus here is quick and confident. I didn't have a single issue of hunting or missed focus, thanks in large part to the fantastic AF technology that's been carried over from the X-T3 and the X-T30. And that's now powered by a hybrid phase detect AF system with 100% coverage that focuses all the way down to -2 EV. Its mechanical shutter maxes out at a 4,000th of a second, and like the other GFX cameras, the GFX 100 eschews a leaf shutter in favour of a focal plane shutter with a 125th of a second sync speed. Shooting with a medium format camera genuinely changes the way you think about photography. A big part of this is down to the format's image ratio. DSLRs traditionally capture images at a 3:2 ratio, but the larger medium format sensor records at a ratio of 4:3, which asks you to compose images with a greater sense of environment and scale. The scale of images captured by a larger sensor enables you to record a ridiculous amount of detail. Zooming in on your images is like playing a game of Where's Waldo, with all kinds of intricate and intimate image information that smaller sensors simply can't capture. Even though it's a bad habit as far as photographic discipline goes, that huge scale also enables you to crop into images to an absurd degree. While shooting this couple on the street, I noticed this other chap against the wall, but I didn't have a chance to move in closer before he moved away. However, I was able to crop into this image, which is 8,736 by 11,648 pixels, and extract a great head and shoulders image that still had a respectable resolution of 2,780 by 2,084 pixels. The same goes for the amount of play in the files, both the 42MB JPEGs and the 208MB RAWs. I took this image in the shadows and then underexposed it for good measure. But it was absolutely no problem to recover all the details from the GFX 100's data-packed RAF files. It all feels like an emphatic improvement on every medium format camera I've used before, and yes, that does include the Phase One. But after a long day's shooting, I headed back to the horrible lighting of my hotel room in Covent Garden to collect my thoughts. So, having spent the day playing with a finished production version of the Fujifilm GFX 100 that also had final firmware, there are some interesting takeaways. And I think for me, really the main one is the handling. Now, I was expecting this to be a really unwieldy, ungainly, tank-like thing, but it was exactly the opposite. I mean, I had no trouble getting this thing around. It was quick, it was responsive, and size-wise, it just wasn't an issue. So I was way off base in terms of my preconceptions about the size of this thing, because it's basically the size of a big DSLR. And when you think about the fact that you're getting so much more internal combustion in this camera, that's a hell of an achievement. So lest we forget, the GFX 100 is packing a mighty 102 megapixel medium format sensor. It's just massive in terms of resolution and the power it produces, but also the dynamic range and the tonality and of course the depth of field. You're getting so much detail and so much image quality, but of course a trade-off of that, or a potential trade-off, is because the sensor is so massive, it also means that even the most minute movement or the most tiny imprecision in your shooting is going to show up in the final image, because it's capturing so much data that before, if you're working with a smaller sensor and a smaller resolution, a little bit of shake might get lost in translation, but with this, it's capturing everything down to hair-fine detail, so any tiny imprecision is going to show up. And that's where the 5-axis in-body stabilization comes into play, and I have to say, that was genuinely impressive. 5-axis, think how image stabilization works. Here's your camera, and you've got a phone, which is my sensor, and it's using 5 magnetic fields to stop the sensor from moving around inside the camera. So whenever you're moving the camera, the sensor it's trying to keep it stable. It's like having an internal gimbal. And that's clever enough when you're talking about Micro Four Thirds, or even full frame with the Sony cameras. But now you're talking about a medium format sensor that's just massive. And I think it's not just the fact that the 5-axis IBIS is involved, it's also the fact that the entire body, the chassis, has been constructed in a way to minimize vibration from every point, to the fact that the lens mount isn't actually connected to the outer shell. The lens mount is connected to the inner frame of the camera to keep it as far away from the shutter system as possible, so that effectively the whole camera body is damped, and that enables you to shoot. I think we have to remember this. Medium format used to be something that involved being nailed down to a tripod, usually in a studio situation. Now, this technology is really liberating us and enabling us to take medium format photography into the street. I'm taking out this 100 megapixel medium format camera with a 110mm lens, none of which should be appropriate for street photography, and yet there I was, out there using it as a street camera, and I think using it fairly successfully. My images, they're not the greatest images in the world, but I took some half-decent pictures, and I think I demonstrated that this camera, put to its most extreme use in a street situation, absolutely up to the task. When I first talked to Fuji about the GFX 100, this is going back to last year sometime, they sort of forewarned me a little bit that the autofocus is going to be good for medium format. But there was that asterisk, it was going to be good for medium format. And if you've used medium format cameras, you know that autofocus is not necessarily their strongest suit. With the GFX 100, this sensor now has got 100% coverage, phase detect and contrast detect, so it's using a hybridized version, the best of both worlds. Now computationally, the GFX 100's autofocus is exactly the same speed as the X-T3 or the X-T30. The only thing that slows it down is physics. It's the fact that the glass elements are so much bigger and heavier in the GFX 100, because obviously a glass element to cover an APS-C sensor is this big, and a glass element to cover a medium format sensor is this big. So you've got a much bigger piece of glass to move back and forth than you do in the smaller sensors, and that's the only thing that slows down the autofocus on this. But even that being said, I didn't find the autofocus to be slow on this camera. And when it comes to face and eye tracking, at least in video mode, the GFX 100, Fuji says, is 500% better in terms of performance than the X-T3 and the X-T30. And that's because you've got the full coverage of that medium format sensor with phase detect and contrast detect AF. It's just that much quicker, that much more effective, and basically the eye tracking and the face tracking now works as you expected it would work on the other cameras.
The other cool video thing, of course, is that the GFX 100 shoots full 4K video at 30 frames a second. In fact, it shoots 4.6K video, it oversamples it and then crunches it down to 4K so you get extra crispy 4K. But here's the kicker, it does it with no crop. And just think about that. Canon can't even do 4K with no crop on an APS-C sensor. It can't even do it on a full frame sensor. And yet here's Fuji doing 4K with no crop on a medium format sensor with 100 megapixels. It's madness. It's madness. Madness. I'm not usually one to geek out over cameras just because they're this or because they're that. I wasn't super excited about full frame mirrorless. I'm not usually that excited about medium format. But I tell you, this camera is seriously, seriously, seriously special. The GFX 100 would just change the way. I could feel it as I was using the thing. It was changing the way I was thinking about and perceiving photography. I just wanted to find big things to shoot. The biggest thing I could find, the biggest scale, so I could capture it in this amazing medium. Oh, so good.
The sad truth is that I can't afford a £10,000 camera, and you probably can't afford it either. The fact of the matter is that I don't really need 100 megapixels, and you probably don't need them either. And neither of us probably has any genuine need to shoot in medium format. But when you use this camera, you want to. It blows the Hasselblad X1D II 50C out of the water, and as good as the GFX 50S and 50R may be, they just don't come close. While the Phase One beats it in terms of raw imaging power, with superior files boasting greater fidelity and dynamic range, the IQ4 is still a lumbering beast that can only be used in very limited applications. The Fujifilm GFX 100 is a medium format camera that can be used for almost anything, almost anywhere. From product shoots in a studio to model shoots on location, and from landscape photography through to street photography. Whether you have to beg, borrow or steal, I highly, highly recommend getting your hands on this camera. It might just turn your ideas about photography completely upside down.